Welcome back to the 5th episode of the legendary Ali saga. In the last episode, we looked at how the undefeated Ali was making quick work of his opponents and had managed to keep the championship belt around his waist. Just when the goals that Ali had worked so hard for had been reached and his life seemed to be in almost perfect order, unforeseen events conspire to shatter his sense of harmony and success. In this episode, we go through a vital part of Ali's story, his iron will to stand up for what he thought was right, even if it came at the cost of losing everything. A technical knockout. Ali's initial confrontation with trouble came in 1964 in the form of a notice from the US Selective Service Board, which he received just before his first fight with Liston. The young fighter ignored the notice that he was to attend an entrance examination for the army. Ali, who was then 22 years old, had been obtaining postponements of this examination since his 18th birthday. These postponements had been arranged by his influential managers, the Louisville millionaires, who had wanted to see him make as much money as he could before his induction into the army. The summons from the Selective Service Board ordered Ali to appear at the board's office in Miami so that his draft status could be judged by board officials. Beginning in the early 1950s, the United States manned its armed forces by means of a system called the Universal Military Draft. According to this system, all young men were required by law to join a branch of the armed forces soon after their 18th birthday or graduation from high school. Under certain circumstances, a young man such as Ali could delay his entrance into the army for a few years. The draft, however, was a federal institution that every young American male had to reckon with sooner or later. The draft was made universal so that the burden of defending the country would be shared equally by all ethnic, religious, and social groups. At least this was how the system was ideally supposed to work. In reality, many people were exempted from the draft. Those who were mentally, emotionally, or physically incapable of service, those with families to support, and those who were studying at a college or a university. The summons from the Selective Service Board was particularly worrisome to Ali because his induction into the army would disrupt his professional career for at least 2 years. Other well-known fighters had been called to serve in the armed forces before Ali. The most notable example was the heavyweight champion Joe Louis, who served in the army during World War II. As a celebrated boxer, Louis served a ceremonial tour of duty. He wasn't sent to the battlefront. Instead, he was asked to visit bases and hospitals both in the United States and abroad. Ali knew that he would be drafted sooner or later because he didn't qualify for an exemption from the draft. Although he had a wife to support, the large amounts of money he'd been making disqualified him from obtaining an exemption so he could provide for his family. Yet, he'd been given assurances that when he was eventually drafted into the army, he wouldn't be sent to Vietnam as a combat soldier. Instead, his stint would be along the lines of Louis's. After all, Ali too was a celebrated boxer. Conscience and his Muslim beliefs were causing him to consider refusing induction into the army because he was politically and morally opposed to America's increasing involvement in the Vietnam War.
And would you have been prepared to go into the army if it hadn't been for the Vietnam War?
No, under no conditions do we take part in wars that take lives of other humans.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Muhammad Ali has just refused to be inducted into the United States Armed Forces.
You my opposer when I want freedom. You my opposer when I want justice. You my opposer when I want equality. You won't even stand up for me in America for my religious beliefs, and you want me to go somewhere and fight, but you won't even stand up for me here at home.
He also believed that the government and the people of the United States shouldn't be involved in what Elijah Muhammad called a fight inside the Vietnamese's own family. Believing that the Vietnam War marked the domination of a foreign race by the white American ruling class, many black Americans were opposed to the war and wanted to focus their attention on the racial injustice at home. Ali and the Nation of Islam were not alone in holding these views. By 1964, many young Americans from all different racial backgrounds strongly disagreed with their country's policy in Southeast Asia, and many of them, like Ali, were willing to express their disagreement by refusing induction into the army. In doing so, they risked a prison sentence of 5 years, or the possibility of a long exile if they chose to avoid the draft by leaving the country. Ali eventually flunked the intelligence test of the Selective Service examination because he didn't answer several of the questions. He claimed that he'd left some of the responses blank because he didn't know the answer to the questions and was reluctant to risk a guess. others thought differently of his actions, which resulted in him receiving a temporary deferment from the Army. Congressman Mendel Rivers of South Carolina stated, "Clay's deferment is an insult to every mother's son serving in Vietnam. Here he is, smart enough to finish high school, write his kind of poetry, promote himself all over the world, make $1 million a year, drive around in red Cadillacs, and they say he's too dumb to tote a gun. Who's dumb enough to believe that?" Such an outcry not only showed the congressman's contempt for Ali, but indicated little appreciation for the feeling of resentment against the war that was growing throughout the United States. No to war. By 1967, the conflict in Vietnam was no longer a minor skirmish at the edge of the civilized world. The US government was spending $2 billion a month on the war and had 450,000 troops stationed in Vietnam. Every week, almost 100 American soldiers died fighting in Vietnam, and more than 500 were wounded. Most crucial to the making of public opinion, this drama of human suffering was broadcast every night via television into the homes of millions of Americans. Mass resistance against the war from many different ages and demographics were constant. This helped Ali's popularity, as he was at the forefront of being anti the war in Vietnam. Growing in popularity. Although Ali was caught in the middle of this conflict, his life in the mid-1960s was not entirely filled with confrontation. He loved the camera, and the camera treated him favorably in return. People around the world responded warmly to his sincerity and to his obvious love of children, even if at times they were baffled by his wilder antics. To many in America, Ali seemed to be a new kind of black man, one who either delighted or horrified his audience, depending on their beliefs and cultural background. He was utterly confident, even cocky, articulate, assertive, and in turn playful and serious. He was always challenging conventional wisdom and authority. With the possible exception of the Brazilian soccer star Pelé, he was the most popular sports figure on earth in the mid-1960s. By 1967, Ali had been the undisputed heavyweight champion for 3 years, and he'd gone beyond the confines of boxing to become a media celebrity. His words and deeds had been denounced and encouraged, explained and analyzed in every major language of the world. Every other week, it seemed, he had a new prediction in verse about the state of the world or the fate of his next opponent in the ring. Ali loved his star status and went out of his way to stir up controversy. He courted other celebrities and notable figures, persons as diverse as the popular wrestler Gorgeous George and the British mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell. Ali's media whirligigs always had a point. They drew people to his fights and increased his purse, the money he could demand for his performance in the ring. In many ways, Ali was a creature of his age. At a time when the influential artistic movement known as pop, which was short for popular, art was combining high and low culture, the comical and the serious, so was Ali. A clear example of his pop sensibility took place on a television talk show in 1965. Ali spoke about his upcoming fight with Patterson, then read some of his poetry while the flamboyant entertainer Liberace played piano in the background. Ali's poetry began, "It all started 20 years past. The greatest of them all was born at last. The very first words from his Louisville lips, I'm pretty as a picture, and there's no one I can't whip." Following his conscience. Although Ali often displayed his comic side to the public, he could also be quite serious about his beliefs and very stubborn in defending them. As America's involvement in Vietnam wore on, Ali needed these qualities to face the difficult times that lay ahead. Until 1966, Ali's status in the files of the Selective Service Board remained classified as 1Y, the designation given to those who had failed either the physical or written part of the Selective Service examination. In February 1966, however, new regulations lowered the requirements of the Army draft. This caused Ali's hometown draft board to change his status to 1A, making him a suitable candidate for service in the armed forces. Ali was informed of the change in his draft status while he was in training for the third defense of his title. He responded with a stanza of impromptu poetry. "Keep asking me, no matter how long. On the war in Vietnam, I sing this song. I ain't got no quarrel with the Viet Cong." His commitment to Islam had created uproar a year ago. This present bit of doggerel, broadcast that very evening on television news programs around the country, kicked up a storm at least equal to the prior controversy. While fan support on one hand countered by terrorizing threats on the other spun in, the good boy his family knew filed for status as a conscientious objector. Ali's anti-war stance poured fuel on the fire that eventually led to him being banned from professional boxing.
That's never been done in history. And all type moves have been made against me that's never been made before in history of boxing.
The first state of note that prohibited him from boxing was Illinois. Before his remark about the Viet Cong, Ali had been scheduled to defend his title in Chicago against Ernie Terrell. Yet several weeks after Ali recited the Viet Cong poem, the Illinois Boxing Commission demanded that he come before them to disavow what he'd said. Ali appeared before the commission, but he would not apologize. The commission then refused him the right to fight in Illinois. The Terrell fight was cancelled. It was later held in Houston on February 6, 1967, and Ali in 1966 was forced to schedule all of his fights but one in foreign cities. Following more failed petitions, Ali's legal team acted to change the location of his draft induction from Louisville to Houston in hope of finding more sympathetic treatment during the inevitable court battle. Their optimism proved unfounded. Ali, true to his word, refused induction inside the courthouse in Houston. For this act of defiance, he was pronounced guilty of draft evasion by an all-white jury. The district judge handed out the maximum sentence of a 5-year jail term and $10,000 fine on June 20, 1967. Ali's attorneys began court appeals to overturn the conviction. During this period, the champ remained free on bail. The boxing lockout started by the Illinois Boxing Commission continued throughout the country until Ali was banned from fighting in every state. The state of New York, along with several other states, revoked his boxing license, and the World Boxing Association stripped him of his World Heavyweight Championship title. Unable to practice his profession, he found it difficult to earn a living. For a while, he wasn't allowed even to leave the country because the government had revoked his passport. The government insisted that he had to remain in the United States until his court case was resolved. Ali was convinced that he'd done the right thing, and that someday the righteousness of his beliefs would prevail. On the night of March 22, 1967, Ali fought Zora Foley at Madison Square Garden in New York City. It was a relatively uneventful evening for the champion. He easily handled Foley, and the fight ended with the challenger being knocked out in the 7th round.
See how well the challenger rolls back from those punches? And there's Foley down! 2 minutes to go in round 7. Champion has plenty himself, there's no question about that. Foley down from that right hand.
Because Foley was just one of many challengers in the secondary rank of heavyweight boxing, this fight was not a particularly important test for Ali. Nonetheless, the Foley fight would prove to be significant. Although Ali didn't know it at the time, the bout would be his last professional fight for more than 3 years. In 1967, Ali was married to Belinda Boyd, who took the Muslim name of Khalila Tolona. In early 1968, their first child was born. His growing family of 4 children with his second wife naturally increased his financial obligations, which included substantial alimony payments to his former wife, Sonji Roy. He also had to pay for the full-time services of the team of lawyers who were appealing the conviction on draft evasion. Ali raised the money for his legal defense and met other financial obligations with the assistance of Muhammad. They improvised an ingenious plan. Ali converted his popularity, especially among the nation's youth, into money. He became a paid speaker on the college lecture circuit. He even persuaded a major book publisher to sign him to a contract for his autobiography, entitled The Greatest, My Own Story. The book was eventually published in 1975. Outside boxing, locking in. The college lecture circuit was the most rewarding of Ali's ventures during his exile from boxing. He'd always been sociable, a fighter who fancied himself a man of the people and who loved to mix with all kinds of people. Yet even Ali was surprised to discover how much of a hero he'd become to the college youth of the 1960s. Ali was buoyed by the support he found on college campuses, and his meetings with students, as well as faculty members, impressed upon him that he was far from alone in his struggle against the Vietnam War. People who came from vastly different backgrounds than his own congratulated him on his stand and offered him their aid. Encouragement from such an unexpected quarter gave Ali good reason to hope for the nation as well as for himself. He felt that perhaps the racial and social antagonisms that racked the country could be overcome, after all. This feeling of hopefulness was diminished somewhat on April 4, 1968, when Martin Luther King Jr., the nation's foremost civil rights leader and Ali's friend, was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. King's assassination set off riots in the black ghettos of more than a half-dozen American cities. The smoke from the burning ghettos of Washington, D.C. could be seen from the steps of the Capitol building. The assassination and the ensuing riots served to remind Americans that, in the words of the report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, the nation was still composed of two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. In this unequal American society, Ali was arrested and sentenced to 10 days in a Dade County, Florida jail for the minor infraction of driving without a valid license. Inside prison, he got an unforgettable taste of how tough the 5-year sentence hanging over him could be, and it could be made worse by the world outside moving forward without him. In some ways, it already had. The sport of boxing didn't stand still with Ali's departure from the scene. A dozen or so young heavyweights pursued the vacated title, and the two major world boxing organizations, the WBA and the World Boxing Council, recognized a number of pretenders to Ali's throne. In time, a clearer picture of the major contenders emerged. Jimmy Ellis, a childhood friend of Ali's as well as a former sparring partner, was the first to lay claim to the title. Not surprisingly, he had a boxing style that was remarkably similar to Ali's. Ellis was a defensive fighter, a boxer in the truest sense of the word. He knew all of the tricks that were required of a polished boxer, including how and when to feint, clinch, and cover up. He lacked two of Ali's main attributes, speed and stamina. These deficiencies left Ellis vulnerable when he met another heavyweight contender, Joe Frazier. Formerly a meatpacker from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Frazier was the archetypal journeyman boxer. There was nothing fancy about his style of boxing. He was a slugger with a steel chin, who challenged his opponents with a relentless attack. Getting back on track. By 1970, the war in Vietnam was dragging on month after month, seemingly without end. Americans were growing impatient for a conclusion to the war, any conclusion, just so long as it allowed the United States to extricate itself honorably from a conflict that seemed to be unwinnable. Ali's team sensed that the Supreme Court would be more receptive to Ali's plea than they had been in 1967 or 1968. The legal team began to prepare Ali's case once more. While one team was scheming for Ali in the halls of justice, Muhammad and his associates were plotting a comeback for Ali in the ring. Frazier, the reigning heavyweight champion, seemed to be the logical opponent for Ali, and both Frazier and his manager Yank Durham were keen for a match. The potential gate for such a fight was huge. It could gross as much as $40 million. The momentum was building to let Ali practice his profession. On June 20th, 1970, a court order overturned his suspension from boxing. 3 months later, a deal was put together that would end his exile. Several powerful black politicians in Atlanta, Georgia, persuaded the mayor to grant Ali a license to fight there. These politicians exercised enough clout in Atlanta, which had a large black population, to secure a binding agreement. Even the avowedly racist Governor Lester Maddox didn't move to block Ali's comeback. The date for the heavyweight championship fight was set for October 26, 1970. At the last minute, Frazier's advisors, who had seemed so willing to have him fight Ali, backed down. They claimed that a prior binding agreement with another less talented fighter prevented them from signing with Ali for the Atlanta fight. In fact, they were actually afraid that their man wasn't ready for Ali, even though he'd not fought professionally for more than 3 years. Ali and the Atlanta promoters quickly found another major contender for him to fight, heavyweight Jerry Quarry. Without Frazier in the ring, the Atlanta match couldn't be considered a championship fight. Furthermore, the Supreme Court still hadn't rendered its final decision on Ali's appeal. Nevertheless, the bout against Quarry meant for the undefeated heavyweight that his exile would finally be over. The king was back, and he was ready to take back his throne. This time, it would cause a fire that the boxing world had never witnessed before. So, stay with us throughout this journey. And as always, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button if you guys enjoyed it.